Today we're going to have some fun with a 1996 Gulf Stream Scenic Cruiser parked out there. It's got an 8.3 Cummins diesel engine. It's all mechanical, so we're going to be turning the power up on it a little bit. That'll be a separate video, but before we do that, I wanted to get some numbers and some readings on how this thing ran before I turned the power up. So right here I have the Banks Motorhome or Banks RV boost gauge and pyrometer kits. Now, I realize that there are maybe other options to this, but I like the fact that this is just a whole kit. There's plenty of wire here to run the length of the RV, and I don't have to mess around with soldering or trying to butt connector stuff up or tie in boost gauge lines to each other. I just like the fact that I could get this whole kit and it was ready to go. So here's our boost gauge here. I've been told that once you turn these up, you can get about 30 psi out of them. Factory, they're around 20. And here's our EGT gauge. As always, you want to see around 1200 or so consistently as a safe zone for maximum temperatures. But I'm very curious to see how this thing runs stock, and then when we turn it up, see how it does after that. But in this video, we're going to be installing the boost gauge and the EGT gauge on a 36-foot motorhome. So what I think I'm going to do, here's a boost gauge. I'll put the boost gauge in this corner right here. And then the EGT gauge, pyrometer, I'm going to put right there. So we've got engine temperature, exhaust gas temperature, oil pressure, and then boost pressure. You can see it pretty easily from this angle here as I'm sitting in the driver's seat. I got this out here so I can get back in there a little bit easier, but as you can see, these old clusters, when you pull these things out, there is just a rat's nest of wiring behind there. So all I really need for these up here is a good source of switched ignition voltage power and then a good source of ground, and that's all the gauges need. But first I'm going to have to go get a little hole saw so I can drill a hole in this right here, enough for the boost gauge to slide into and the pyrometer to slide into, but also enough for it to catch on this lip and then hold the gauge firmly in place like these others are here. So I'm going to measure the gauge at its widest point, and it looks like it's about 2 inches. So we need to go get a 2-inch hole saw to drill the hole in the dashboard for these two gauges. Pardon the background noise. I've got the generator running so I could run my shop back here and clean up the shavings. But I got my hole saw there, and I drilled the 2 holes for the gauges. So we've got the holes drilled in the little instrument cluster gauge board here, I guess you call it. It's pretty easy, pretty straightforward. The gauges fit nice and perfectly snug with the 2-inch hole saw. So now we just got to run some wiring. So here are the gauges installed. They look really, really good. I'm really happy with how this turned out. You get easy view of your boost and EGT there along with everything else. And if these needles were white like the others were on here, these gauges would almost look factory. But it looks really good. I love the analog gauges. It is quite a rat's nest of wiring behind this board here. But actually tapping into the light circuit was really easy. So because this is LED and hardly pulls any power, I simply ran the black and red wires for the lighting into these connectors right here. Just strip back the wire a little bit and connect it to these plugs. You can kind of see how they're spliced in with the plug. It's pretty solid. It's not going to go anywhere. It's going to stay put, so I'm happy with how that turned out. Just did this gauge here and that gauge there, tied into those. Now if you look below here, you can see where the boost gauge is. There's the boost gauge down there. There's a boost tube that runs off of it. And then that just runs and disappears down here into all that other stuff. This yellow wire that you see here is the wiring coming from the EGT gauge, the EGT probe. And then that disappears down there as well. Running the 40 foot of wiring and boost tube for these gauges was the most time-consuming, difficult part because I had to figure out where I was going to go with it. But I ran it down here. You can see
That bright yellow wire is kind of your reference. You can see the bright yellow wire and then that black tube, that's for the boost. That runs down through here, through this little access port. I'll go outside and show you where it ran next. Here's the driver's side front. You open this little compartment door, reveals a whole bunch of wiring, and you can see there's a yellow wire there. And the boost tube runs down there. I ran a little bit of extra slack in there just in case, so I'd have it. And then it goes out through the back here. Crawl underneath the RV and show you where it goes from there. From there, it runs out of the box behind the wheel here, and I've just got it zip tied to help it stay in place. You can see it running along with that bunch of other wires there. One thing that was nice is there's so many other wires and tubes ran on this thing, it was easy to just follow a path that was already made. Then it runs along the bottom here. You can see it running along there, all the way to the back. Once we got to the back here, it was pretty easy back here. The boost line splits off, goes right above the drive shaft here. As you can see, it's just held up right there. And the EGT probe continues its way back to the exhaust side of the engine on the driver's side here. Underneath the bed here in the master bedroom on the back of the RV, we're looking down at the engine here. You can see the yellow wire for the EGT probe. That runs back here. I just kind of have it zip tied around and a little bit of the extra slack tucked up here. This connector bolts into place. There's a couple screws that you fasten the ends of the wires here together, and then you heat shrink this into place. Now, I ran my EGT probe right here. This was a little bit of a tight fit. The turbocharger's right here, and then that EGT probe is right there, but I had just enough room to get the drill in there, drill the hole, tap it with the correct thread size, and then install the EGT gauge probe right there. So that's just about in the middle of the manifold. It's close enough for me. The EGT reading is spot on. That's right where I wanted it to be. So on the other side, we're about right here, right underneath the exhaust side of the turbocharger. Now the boost line runs up on this side here. You can see it running up along those AC lines. Runs up there and then comes off to the side here. And this was actually very easy because there was already a plug installed there. All I had to do was remove that plug, and the threads were the correct size. I threaded the boost gauge tube fitting in, and it worked great. So that tube just sits there now. There is some copper piping that you can run up there initially, but I'm just going to see how it does with the plastic tube. I've got extra if needed. But this was the most time and labor intensive part of the whole job, was running all these, running the wire and the tube the entire length of this unit. But it works great. I'm really happy with how it turned out. So let's take it for a drive, see what kind of EGTs we're getting and how much boost this is putting out before we turn the power up with the TST modifications. All right, so here we are. Here's a view of the gauges. The engine's been running for a little bit, so you can see the temperature gauge is just starting to creep up above 100 there. We're sitting at about 300 EGTs. That's what it seems to do at idle. We'll give it some throttle here and see how the gauges look. So about what I expected. They told me this engine stock will put out, or the turbo will produce about 25 pounds of boost and anywhere between 900 and 1,000 EGTs is about average. Now I've driven it around a little bit before I took this video clip, and it's interesting how if the torque converter locks and the engine's in a higher gear around 1,000 or 1,100 RPM, the EGTs seem to get way up there, like around the 1,000 range. But as long as that turbo's putting out good boost, the EGTs stay fairly cool. So, seeing as a 1200 degrees Fahrenheit mark for EGTs is a pretty safe limit, I'm going to say this engine has some decent room to turn it up and give it some more power. I'm looking forward to getting the TST mods done on the turbo and the injection pump. This should be pretty interesting. The engine's warmed up a little bit now. Give it a little bit of a wide open throttle here. Got a little bit of a hill to climb here. Give it a little test. Right up the hill, no problem. Third gear, all that torque.